Despite the accent and where I grew up, which is in Arizona, about 100 miles from Mexican border, Europe played a very important role. My mother was born in Berlin during the Second World War. She then moved to Lübeck and then was raised in Denmark by a relative. So the way our house was decorated, we would go to Denmark every summer. So in many ways, Europe was a very big part of our life. She spoke some Danish at home. So that was important, and we were also quite different from the other families in terms of the way our furniture looked, the kinds of people we were. And by the time I went to university, probably like a lot of Americans, in my late teens, Europe was distant but also very present. They had these so-called histories of Western civilization courses, and the kind of driving story of those courses that the United States is kind of inheriting the legacy of Europe. And so it's important for American students to learn about the history of Europe as a way of understanding what worked, what didn't work, and the relationship then between the United States and Europe. So that was very important, and the kind of formative kind of university events or causes. The Solidarność movement, for example, was a big campus issue. When I was there, we all had our t-shirts, and this kind of newfound solidarity with Eastern Europe was actually very, very powerful. I mean, the South African divestment movement was also a key campus issue. So those were the kind of things that shaped a lot of our political awareness. But this kind of attitude and solidarity with the Solidarity movement in Poland was, very, very strong, and I think quite unusual for American liberal arts university students to feel a particular connection, especially to an area of Europe, Eastern Europe, which they knew very, very little about. So from that point then I went on to become a school teacher, an independent school in Connecticut, in which I was asked to teach courses on European history to high school students. So there was a moment in which I had moved from one end of the desk to the other, from a student to an instructor. And I think through that, and through lots of reading in terms of how am I going to communicate a story of Europe to 14 and 15-year-old kids, that was very, very powerful in terms of trying to sense what sort of narratives I'm trying to convey as a teacher in the classroom. I think that it was a flawed continent, that it had the story of great cultural achievement, but also one in which, especially in the wake of the Second World War, had experienced also the depths of depravity, crimes against humanity. So in a sense that the kind of extremes of European history, I think it was one that was driven home to all of us. And again, it was the idea that the United States has a particular role to play militarily, economically, politically, and culturally, as in a sense, one of the superpowers to try to keep the Cold War cold, and to, in a sense, act as a kind of retaining wall from anything would be a repetition of that particular past, but also to kind of give opportunities for Europe, at least in that case, Western Europe, to grow and thrive. Now, that was a particularly strong Cold War ideology, and again, I kind of grew up in it. It changed as I changed, and I moved to West Berlin in 1987. I saved a little bit of money, and I wanted to learn German, and that, I think, in many ways, was the formative experience for me. It was really university, I think, where I was learning a lot about the kind of narrative and place of Europe in the world, changing place. And again, this was toward the end of the Cold War. Of course, we had no idea that 1989 was on its way, but this is mid-1980s. And I think so in a sense, the drivers or the shapers of that narrative came from university instructors, the kinds of textbooks that we would read, but was one in which it seemed like a settled story of unfortunate division, about the Cold War divide. It looked very, very permanent. So for all this kind of sense in which 1989 was inevitable, absolutely not. It didn't seem like Europe in that way was changing very much. And I went to West Berlin in 1987. That, strangely enough, was kind of confirmed living there. But the people that were driving this story were teachers, university instructors, history book writers, certain politicians in the United States that were more pro-European, But it was certainly a sense in which it was a very close and important relationship between the U.S. and Europe, and that Atlantic community was a very, very powerful kind of framework for understanding the continent. As I grew older and learned more, that became less convincing to me, and those differences were also very powerful. But that's, in a sense, the kind of Cold War story that we all inherited, which would be quite different, I imagine, when you talk to other people here. When I moved to West Berlin in 1987 to learn German, many things changed. I mean, Berlin was not a typical city. I mean, it was kind of the so-called outhouse in the West, and it had this strange combination of being very cosmopolitan and very provincial. The wall, the presence of the wall was absolutely everywhere. It's a very small city when it was kind of walled in. You felt like a kind of floating island in the middle of communist East Germany. It was difficult to cross borders. You had to fly to other airports and take a train in most of the time. Guards were very, very present. And so it drove home to me the kind of power of the Cold War as an emblem. Also the presence of the Second World War in terms of the pockmarked buildings, and you could still see lots of evidence of fighting in the Second War, especially in East Berlin. I mean, the crossing of borders. So I think what had been a kind of story of a kind of moral narrative about U.S., let's say Western European relations felt very real when I was there. And again, the presence of the past is something I didn't expect. And so I was kind of hooked in terms of devoting my whole, I guess, professional life and career to studying German history in Europe, because there's something about that live sense of that the past was still so present, and the kind of funny combination of, let's say, a city made up of pensioners on crutches and then a lot of left-wing students without any kind of classic Western middle class there. So it was a range of contradictions, and history was hanging so heavily in the air that it got me very interested. And I happened to be there in the year with this big historians debate in 1987, a kind of book that was trying to compare the atrocities of the Nazi years to Stalin. And it was a big discussion then about how we understand the Second World War, what is the kind of broader narrative of German history, how unique or how comparable is the Holocaust. And these things were really, really live issues in 1987. So I just happened to walk into that, and there was a lot of discussion on television, radio about that. So in a sense, my narrative was changing, in that you could see that Europe was starting to move in different directions. It wasn't quite respecting the old pieties about a kind of what we would now call a kind of politically correct history, which it was doffing its cap to all the kind of orthodoxies of saying the Second World War, that was how it all started, what happened, how it ended. There was a kind of conservative narrative that was coming from Bonn that was starting to revise that story. They were tired of having foreigners, especially Americans, wagging their finger about what Germans had or hadn't done in the Second War. And there's a kind of effort to start building a different German identity, which was not linked to the Atlantic Alliance so strongly. And so I was there at a kind of moment in which that ground was shifting, and that was actually quite interesting to see. Again, I didn't quite understand it. I was in my early 20s, and later reading about it, you can kind of see that there were sea changes going on, where the Germans are starting to develop their own foreign policy. They're not quite adhering to a lot of the stories that had been the main stories for the last 15 to 20 years. So by the time 1989 hit, there was a kind of reconfiguration of German policies, and I think some of that was already there in the 1980s. I do. I mean, I'm still a very pro-European. I do believe that there's been a good deal of learning about the past. I mean, we're in a funny moment now with a kind of rise of right-wing populism, often which is directly aiming at some of the orthodoxies of 1989 in terms of the things that it represented: freedom of movement, democracy. And now there's a kind of game on to describe democracy as illiberal, as authoritarian. Different adjectives were using to describe what seemed like a pretty agreed idea of liberal democracy in 1989. So I think we're in a kind of moment of transition in which many things are up for grabs. I think we've been slow to realize the kind of groundswell of discontent, unhappiness, partly driven by economic equality, a range of other issues, the comeback of nationalism and a kind of religious conservatism. I think the European narrative will persist. It's certainly under attack, and I think it needs to be strongly defended. I think we have to be more active and more conscious about defending something that we've grown unaccustomed to defend. I think it becomes so much a part of the kind of mental furniture of who we are that we lost our will and our kind of our ability to actually tell a wider public why it matters. And I think it's now incumbent on all of us to say that there was a fight on at various key moments of European history, 45, 68, 1989, and now today, that you have to fight for a particular idea of a kind of peaceful, cooperative, pluralistic, multicultural Europe. But that is all under attack, and I think now, in a sense, with the kind of story of competing narratives, it's really the time actually to come up with kind of better and stronger narratives that aren't just reproducing what we've heard for many, many decades, which doesn't have the kind of experiential or the existential appeal to a lot of younger people because they haven't lived through a lot of this. I certainly didn't. I mean, I'm too young, of course, to remember what had happened in the 1940s and 50s, but it was enough in which that communication seemed to be much, much stronger, and I think we've lost our ability, whether in the classrooms or in the wider public, to convey those stories.